Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Bartlett, the head librarian of the New York Society Library. As we begin, let me please ask you all if you have a cell phone or a pager or anything that will beep or make any kind of noise, please just take it out and turn it off for us for the next hour. We do appreciate that. I do want to thank all of our library members for their support last year. The annual appeal was very successful in 2011, and we're really happy to be back in 2012 with another great year of programs like this evening's, our growing collection, our very active community of readers and writers, and everything we do here at the Society Library. The day that will live in infamy, the dawn of the nuclear age, the greatest generation. The Second World War was so central to the 20th century that it's extremely hard to talk about it except in cliches. Historian Tony Jute calls everything between 1945 and 1989 an interim age created by the war. That's how massive, complex, and far-reaching it was. Both Richard Snow and Ellen Feldman, our guests this evening, have found ways to get their minds around the war and its aftermath, but to take their readers with them. In each case, the key is personal narrative, with Richard's very good book, Measureless, Peril, the experience of his father on a destroyer in the Atlantic, and in Ellen's case, the experience of three fictional but representative women and their families. Ellen Feldman is a dear friend of the library. We'll be very honest about that. She's been a member here for a long time. She's a 2009 Guggenheim Fellow. She's the author of several very successful novels, including Lucy, The Boy Who Loved Anne Frank, a favorite of mine, and Scottsboro, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize. I'm really proud to add that she's spoken here at the library a couple of times on these recent novels, as well as having her tonight for a current one. Richard Snow is known to many of you for his work at American Heritage, magazine that he worked at for nearly 40 years, and I believe 17 of them as editor-in-chief. He also has written several historical novels, as well as other nonfiction titles and screenplays. He's consulted for historical motion pictures, including Glory, and documentaries, including the Burns Brothers' The Civil War, and Ken Burton's World War II documentary. Our friends from the Corner Bookstore are out in the Peluso Family Exhibition Gallery, and they're happy to sell you a copy of either of their new books after our event, and I know that both authors will be happy to sign copies for you this evening. So please join me in welcoming Ellen and Richard.
Thank you. This is clear? Yes. Thank you very much. I think I'll start by saying that Ellen and I have never done anything like this before, so if it seems a little scrabbly and improvised, it is. But I wanted to start because not only was Ellen's book published much more recently than mine was, but it's also, I'm sorry to say, I think more interesting. It's very strange to me. This book is about women in the war, at home, from Pearl Harbor to the Kennedy years, because it makes the strong and significant point that, you know, for a lot of people, the war is only beginning when the guy is killed in the Ardennes. That it's the rock dropped in a pond whose ripples will spread down the years. And she does this both forcefully but unobtrusively. But why it's surprising, I think, is that I can't there are a couple of movies, Best Years of Our Lives, Swing Shift, about women in the, about women at home, but I can't think of a single novel. Now, Ellen said when I mentioned this to her that there's probably a lot of a genre that I didn't quite understand existed called commercials women's fiction that may include this as a subject, but I'd be sort of surprised because the other thing Ellen has done is put in a formidable amount of research into this, and it's all this painstaking stage setting before you can get somebody into a bar. You know, where do you park your car? What does the car look like? What does the guy say? All this has to be learned and yet has to be deployed effortlessly, or you just feel that the author is showing off. That never happens in Next to Love. The other thing I asked Ellen to let me do against her her protest, born of modesty, was to read a fan letter she got. And I think it's a remarkable fan letter. It's not just a fan letter. It's by a guy, as you'll see, who was there. But he has gotten the whole point and thrust of the book, and I think expressed it perfectly, if eccentrically. He has written something that is, telegraphic isn't quite the right word because it's really like a telegraph. But here's what he says, and everything he says is right. And this is the message in its entirety. It's from somebody named Bob Bagman. Prologue, in 6 pages, sets the small town meeting setting. Babe Huggins, Swallow's Drugstore, Mr. Gooding, Mr. Creighton, followed by telegrams, anxiety, fear, emotional pain. This is the news coming in from the Normandy landings. Mr. Shaker delivers telegrams, swimming pond scene. Memories of Sam Shaker's volunteering task linger for years. Immediately captures the interest of the reader. Theme for the remainder of the book. Flashback, April 1945. And now it's Mr. Bagman talking about himself. European theater. My brother was seriously wounded, 714th Tank Battalion, 3rd Army. He managed to send a letter before the telegram arrived. Claimed only a broken finger. Was more than that. Telegram delivered later by Red Cross volunteer. Made essentially complete recovery. I went to Atlantic City to sign him out of the hospital. Army took over hotels. Past the Haddon Hall. Hospital, hotel. Sunday. Hundreds of GIs sunning the stumps of amputated legs. For many years post-war, I went to scientific meetings in Atlantic City, never forgot that image. Always wondered what those GIs eventually made with their lives. Tough business. And then to Ellen, your work has important meaning. And I think that's quite a masterly summary. And I'd like to ask you to tell perhaps a little more about your book than Mr. Bagman did. And what got you to write it? And what got you to write it?
Okay. Believe it or not, this is supposed to be about both of our books. Can you hear me? Okay. And Richard kept saying, no, I'm just introducing you, and I kept saying, no, people, his book is wonderful. I didn't prepare it in detail, but I'm rereading it again. His research is exhaustive and prodigious, but what's really amazing, and then I'll let him tell you about his book, is that it's about his father as emblematic of, which I'm trying to do too in my book, as emblematic of, I think, the young man, and his father was not that young, who fought in World War II. And it's an amazingly unusual book in that Richard has a sure sense of when to go back and forth. So you're reading a very personal story, but you're also reading a story about this entire battle of the war. Everything from the development of radar to his father's letters, which are extraordinary and which he was kind enough to let me read, and I used a lot in my book. Also, without Richard, I couldn't have written this book. I would have written a book, but it would have been a lesser book, because there was nothing I needed to know that he didn't know. And in fact, I'll get to one thing that he explained to me very early on in my research. The inspiration for my book, the title comes from a World War I quotation. War next to love has most captured mankind's imagination. And I think, and that's really what the book is about, war and what it does to relationships and love and families, and how people got through it. The inspiration was a group of young men called the Bedford Boys, who were from a small town, 3,200 at the time, in Bedford, Virginia. They joined the National Guard in the 30s, not out of any particular patriotism. I'm not suggesting they weren't patriotic, but just because it was the Depression and they got paid for being the National Guard. When war loomed, they were all called up together. They trained in this country together, they went to England together, they trained there, and they were all in the first wave on Omaha Beach on December 6, 1944. 19 of them were killed in the first few minutes. 4 died before the end of the day, before the day was out. That's 23 young men from a very small town, so everybody knew everybody. One of the amazing things that I discovered, and this is where Richard explained things to me, is the telegrams didn't start to come in until 6 weeks later. And I thought, I must be doing something wrong with my research. Richard said, no, think about it. D-Day was such a massive, chaotic invasion that it would take that long to sort things out and for the telegrams to begin arriving to the families of the young men. The aftermath of this tragedy is that because it took so long, their wives and parents and children kept writing them during this 6-week period. They weren't getting any mail back, but they thought, okay, that's wartime. After they got the telegrams, their own letters began to come back, stamped with one black word: deceased, deceased, deceased. So it was the pain all renewed each time. The book is not about the Bedford Boys because I saw them as emblematic of what was going on the home front at that time. Everybody, it's not like the wars in this country now. Everybody knew somebody in World War II. Everybody had someone close. And so this affected the entire country. And I wanted to use the Bedford Boys, or a group of young men, to show that. The second inspiration for the book came from 2 women. One I knew personally growing up as a child, the other the mother of a friend who I never met but heard stories about. They both lost their husbands very young and had diametrically opposed reactions. One essentially canonized her husband. She never got over his death. She married again, but it was an unhappy marriage, and she just could not get beyond this point. The other woman remarried immediately. I'm not suggesting she didn't grieve, but she remarried immediately because she was determined to get on with her life. And her child, her husband, her dead husband, her first husband, and the father of her child, became a deep, dark secret. Her child knew that she had a biological father who was not the father who had adopted her, but she didn't even see a photograph of him until her teenage years. And I found these 2 reactions to this early loss quite astonishing. That said, once again, I write fiction, and the minute I start to write about these 2 women, they became fictional characters for me. They're the women I imagined and not the 2 that I'd heard about. There's a third protagonist who in fact became the main protagonist in the book. I don't know where she came from. She just sidled up to me one day and said, let me deliver those telegrams for you, and she wouldn't leave the book. And that is one of the joys of writing fiction, which Richard can't do, and now I'll turn it back and you can talk.
I do hope that a significant portion of my book isn't fiction. I think, like, inspiration might be the wrong word, but I do remember the first moment I thought this might be worth writing about, and it was a long time ago. It was in the late 1970s when and I started the book with this actually, when my parents had come back from a 2-week vacation in Maine to the apartment we were living in Westchester, and the apartment superintendent, who was a powerful guy named Mr. Curcio, was taking their luggage out of the trunk, and I was helping in a feeble way, and something, it might have been the weather, it was a windy blue day, reminded him of his having taken part in the invasion of Sicily. And he suddenly startled us all by saying good-naturedly about his Italian heritage, "Look, I'm a Wop." But, he said, once those Wops on the beach started firing at me, I was 100% American. I said, these guys aren't kidding, and I started shooting when I was still in the surf. And he kept on with this while he got these suitcases up to the door. And at the door, we all thanked him. And then my mother put a protective hand on my father's arm and told Mr. Curcio, "I am so glad Dick was never in combat." Now, on April 27th, 1945, my father was on the bridge of his ship, which was a small destroyer escort called the USS Nunzer, and one of the other officers pointed and said, "What's the matter with the Davis?" And the Davis was the Frederick C. Davis. It was a sister ship, exactly the same size, absolutely identical. It was in a scouting line hunting a submarine 1,500 yards away. And something was wrong. It was funny, it was canted over in the water, but not for long. It split in half and sank. It had taken a German torpedo in its forward fire room. Nobody had heard the explosion, but it took 110 men to their deaths almost immediately, and the rest of the destroyers in the squadron chased it for 14 hours before they were finally able to destroy it, after having helped pick up the survivors. And my mother, after we were indoors, recounted this. My father recounted this to my mother, and my father recounted this to my mother, and said with what I thought was quite admirable restraint, "You know, that's generally considered having been in action." And now, but my mother wasn't stupid. She knew my father had been at sea. What she was sort of saying was what everybody, even when they were taking part of it in a way, thought about our naval war in the Atlantic. Even people in the middle of it didn't quite see it as a coherent battle. A battle was something that happened when big glamorous aircraft carriers came together and you changed the course of a nation in 5 minutes, the way we did the Japanese at Midway. This was a long, bitter, brutal, in many ways very boring campaign, which was a delivery system. We were getting trucks and chocolate and guns and uniforms, men, from America and Canada across the sea to England and there to the fighting fronts. And the Germans, opposing this effort, didn't want any battles at all. They were pretty much, these guys were not cowards, but they were pretty much forbidden to engage a warship if they didn't have to. They were to sink the trucks that were carrying the food. So it was, and it began, this fight, before America got into it, on the first day of the war, and really didn't end until the very last day. So it was certainly the longest sea battle in history, and possibly the longest. Now, Winston Churchill did understand the meaning of this, and that's where I got the title of my book. He said once, "How often would I have exchanged a full-scale invasion for this measureless peril?" And it was measureless because it was almost impossible to tell who was ahead, because it wasn't just a calculation of this ship was sunk, or, certainly not that cruiser's off the board, so we don't have that gunpowder anymore. It was, are we going to have enough food to feed the country? Are the European fighting fronts going to fall? How fast can we build ships? And how do we stop the goddamn submarines, which we had underrated in World War I, and now we're underrating all over again. So as I read, we did that through dozens of different and ingenious ways, But as I read it, I realized that I thought that my father's story, since he went in in 1943 and was on the destroyer, I thought he could serve like Ellen's women as being sort of emblematic of the whole thing. But that wasn't the case at all. He doesn't come on until the last quarter of the book, because it was a great surprise to me to learn how very much real fighting America was doing there even before we were in the war. So it became much more of a research project than I'd expected, and also, in a way, much more interesting. But anyway, that's what I tried to do.
Okay, and now you're supposed to tell us.
What am I supposed to tell you now?
You're supposed to tell us why World War II retains its interest for readers and for writers. For writers first and then for readers.
Oh, that's an unanswerable question.
Good, I felt the same way. That's why I came to you.
I mean, beyond the obvious, and the unobvious, it's almost hard, it's almost impossible to grasp the obvious. Just in the last week, reading Max Hastings' very good new history of the whole war, I learned the sort of astounding statistic, which I wrote down here for you, that from September 39, when the Germans punched into Poland, to August 45, when Japan gave up, 27,000 people were killed per day. I mean, whatever extinguished the dinosaurs may have been more calamitous than that, but in human terms, this is unprecedented. It's unprecedented in some different sort of other ways. I mean, worked at the history magazine all my life. I can't think of any war America fought when a generation, or in some cases only a few years later, everybody thought, what a waste of time that was. I mean, even the ones, like, even the Civil War, which did not generate that response by 1890, both sides were being sentimental about the other, and the North had allowed, the South was fighting for its rights, and the South had allowed that they were glad they were under the eagle after all. I mean, everybody was fine, except the people who got free, and in those days. But after World War I, it took about 8 months before everybody thought we'd sold out to the ruined aristocracy and gun manufacturers of Europe. Vietnam, it happened while the war was. But World War II, looking back on it across what's getting on to close to 70 years, we only realized that what we were confronting was even more dangerous and indeed more evil than what we had perceived at the time. And I think that makes it unique. It's certainly the only war I ever drew on when I was trying to give my children an ethics lesson, because it does combine every color of real good, real evil, and all the declensions in between. And beyond that, it so completely shook up our world that we are still living very much in the aftermath of it, from our microwave ovens to our highway system, than we ever were 10 years after World War I. I just think it's the single most important event almost in history.
That's a pretty convincing answer, yeah. Okay. I'm going to move on.
Now, I have to ask you,
This wasn't scripted.
I say, why World War II retains its interest, and it's Ellen, Letters of War.
Okay. As I said, I read a lot of Richard's letters home. Apparently, he promised she said he could enlist. He was not young. He was,
I'll tell him, yeah.
Okay, I won't step on your
okay.
So I read a lot of letters in general of many men who had been in service during the war. Obviously, I just read the ones that were published because I didn't have any except for Richard's father's. This country probably has attics full of letters like this because I know I've gotten emails since the book has been published by people who have told me that they then asked their parents, are there letters or something like this. One woman wrote me and said her mother wouldn't show her the letters, which I loved. One of the really interesting things is that...
Did she say why?
It's just too personal and none of her business. Yeah.
Fair answer.
And that leads to something really interesting about these letters. This generation is generally known as a fairly silent generation. Men didn't talk about their feelings. And certainly when they came home, they didn't want to talk about the war. But these letters are astonishing. Some of them are beautifully written. Some of them are barely intelligible. They all share one thing, and that's passion. And two things, passion and longing. I mean, these men were very, very young by and large, except for your father. I'm not suggesting he was an old man. What makes it even
His
more...
shipmates thought he was.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, in the research, I was reading about the Air Force, and they call the commander of the base the old man. The old man was 27. But these were young men who were terrified, who were away, many of them away from home for the first time. What's astonishing about these letters is they had to be read by their officer, not the commanding officers, their officers above them. So they're writing these very personal, passionate letters. And some of them are even physically passionate. And they knew that they were going to be read by the men who were living cheek by jowl with, and they still did. They still wrote them, and they're very, very moving. I've written articles about it, and I say, young women now who complain about getting no more than 140 characters in a message, it was a different era, and they're quite beautiful, and they're moving, and they're very instructive about what was like. And life was like during that time. While they couldn't identify, they couldn't write where they were going, they could talk about daily life, so you really get a very accurate picture of what it was like. Also, I found one collection of letters, and I used it in the book, where the young man wanted to be an artist, and he said more than one, and he sent home these marvelous sketches of the kids in England and of his mates on the ship and that sort of thing. They're marvelous.
Well, I was very fortunate in my father's letters because they traced the whole arc of his career. I mean, once I could get him into the story, he really did stand in for the 80,000 men like him who a year before had no more thought of joining the Navy than they had of joining the service, and now were suddenly had to become competent military people. The reason they exist is that my father was like all of them, but not quite like, because he was, as Ellen says, considerably older. He was born in 1905. He got out of architecture school in the very hopeful year of 1930, and then scrambled around to try and support himself in a business that almost didn't exist. But then, when the war started in Europe, things warmed up, and then he got commissions for the 39 World's Fair, and he had his own architectural shop, and he was doing very well. And when Pearl Harbor came, he was immediately taken in because, they needed people who knew structure. Everybody had built a lot of stuff all of a sudden, and he had a great job. He'd just been married for 8 months. They gave him they commissioned him a lieutenant junior grade. They gave him a nice blue uniform. He was living in Manhattan. 2 or 3 days a week, he'd take the subway to the ferry and look at the barracks being built on Staten Island and check where fire points were in the right places. And then he'd come back and then dinner with my mother and go to bed with her. And he hated it. He got so embarrassed from taking salutes on the subway from men who were back from the real fighting in the Atlantic that even though he was of the extreme age of 35, he was 36, he managed to, he told my mother he thought he knew somebody and thought he could pull some strings. In fact, it was the husband of an old girlfriend who got him in. And my mother didn't like this one bit, but she said, "Okay, Dick, you go do it. I know you have to, but here's the deal. You write me every single day." And he had some very rough days, but he came very close to fulfilling that promise. I knew the letters were there. She kept them very carefully. I've never read them because I was too lazy. I mean, it's a lot, one handwritten letter is a charming artifact. 400 of them is irksome toil. But when I did, they were very good and extremely helpful. And he did. There were only I only counted 4 days when he was at sea that he had not written her, and one of them was a hurricane where they thought they were going to have to abandon the ship. So I think he was off the hook for that. And of course, it was very touching to hear him. They were intimate. They weren't. There wasn't much about the actual physical intimacy that Ellen was talking about, which was perfectly fine with me. but they were, warm, loving, very, very, very chatty and discursive, very relaxed. And it is interesting to think that people got used to the censoring eye passing over those letters, because there was no feel of that in these, and I don't think in the ones you read, right?
None at all. You don't sense that somebody is reading over their shoulders.
And it was, it became, I transcribed them, and they gave me the last quarter of the book, and for once again, even though he had gone to his grave, my father had helped me out in a significant way, so I was very moved by the experience.
I'm going to move ahead a little bit, then we come back to the war, because about half of my book covers the period from the end of the war to 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. I knew before I even started research that every war transformed the society that wages it. I had no idea how much this country was transformed by World War II. As you were saying, we're still living with much of it. To begin with, it became a much more fluid nation. Before this, most of the country had pretty much stayed in their own backyards. People grew up with people who looked the way they did and thought the way they did, and probably died a few miles from where they were born, or several miles. Suddenly, you had 16 million men going into uniform. You had millions more leaving farms and small towns to work in factories and government offices and that sort of thing. So you had people coming up against the other. And it wasn't always easy. There was a lot of prejudice. There were slurs both in the barracks and in civilian life. But I think nothing breaks down prejudice like proximity and perhaps fear, the issue with men in battle and men in uniform. 3 groups were really affected by the war. 2 minorities and 1 oppressed group. The minorities are African Americans and Jews. The oppressed group is women. 500,000 Jewish young men served in World War II. Some enlisted because they thought of the war against Germany as particularly their own. Others were drafted. They left largely ghettoized existences to serve with, as I said, people whom they hadn't known before, who'd never known a Jew before. And it was some of these men had to fight battles in the barracks before they even got to the front. And you read these in the letters and memoirs too. There were also personal struggles of these men. There was an expression, eating ham for Uncle Sam. Many of these young men had been kosher before the war, and suddenly they've had a day of really difficult training, and somebody puts a pork chop on their plate, and then a pat of butter on the pork chop. And this is from a memoir by one young man who was just sickened by it, and he walked away. Others said, no, I eat ham for Uncle Sam. There was the other problem of, do you take off if you're going into battle? And this would not be at sea, this would be in the European theater on land. Do you take off your dog tag that has an H on it for Hebrew in case you're captured by the Germans? You could take it off because you were afraid, but then you were a little ashamed. So these were personal struggles. What happened, I think, is that the young men who came out of this this experience were not only much more worldly after it, but resolved that they would never again be second-class citizens in the country they had fought and lost bodies for. And they made big changes after the war. Some of the same things happened with African-American troops. The problem was they did not serve with the other. We did not, Truman integrated the military not until 3 years after the war in 1948. The party line at the time was that our boys were fighting to preserve a way of life. African-American soldiers were fighting to change that way of life. They thought if they could prove themselves in battle, they would get a better shake at home, a fairer deal. Of the 1 million African-American young men who served, only about 50,000 got to see combat because the feeling was they were not smart enough or loyal enough or trustworthy enough to fight in battles. But like the Jewish young men, they came home resolved that they had some who had been in Europe really had their eyes open because they were treated much better there than they were at home. And they came home and resolved never again to be second-class citizens. It wasn't quite that easy. Apparently, there was a rash of lynchings after the war, and almost all of them were to veterans, and some of them still in uniform. However, there's no doubt that the young men who had served in the war did become active in this. Many of them became active in the civil rights movement. On a happier note, women, between 6 and 8 million women, I've read two statistics, went out to work during the war. The party line was they couldn't wait for the war to be over to give up their jobs and go back at home, back to their homes. Well, this was not quite the case. A lot of them had a really good time making money, making their own decisions, getting out in the world. And the government was worried about this because, again, we had 16 million men coming home, getting out of uniform and looking for jobs. The only thing that had ended the Depression was the war. So what were we going to do? We had to keep women at home. I mean, it was this World War II, the old World War I song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Peril? So they had to get the women home. There was no actual policy, but a couple of industries that catered to women kind of came through here. One was the fashion industry. Right after the war, Christian Dior came out with the new look, and I think a lot of people in this room remember it. During the war, women, partly because of the regulations, you couldn't have wide skirts, you couldn't have more than 2 pockets on a jacket, that sort of thing. So after the war, Christian Dior had these amazing dresses that were very cinched to the waist, tight shoulders, and yards of skirt, almost like the Civil War. During the war, these women were wearing slacks and short skirts and could move and reach and whatnot. All you could do in a Christian Dior dress was stand there and look pretty. And that's exactly what women were supposed to do after the war. They were supposed to give up the freedom they had had. The other women's industry that came to women were the women's service magazines. Even if you worked in an office or on a factory floor, you were supposed to get home and get dinner on the table for your family at night. So 1944 Good Housekeeping has a recipe that has 2 little clocks at the top that tells you start at 6 and you've got dinner on the table by 6:30. 1950, you had to keep the women in the kitchen. So there's a recipe for dinner that starts right after breakfast. There's a recipe I use in the book that has 37 ingredients. And we're not talking about, Julia Child cooking. We're talking about Campbell's soup, that sort of thing. But you had to keep women busy this way. The happy upshot of this is that Junie was already a bottle. And the women who went out to work in the 40s were the mothers of the women who made the feminist revolution of the 1970s. And that's kind of a nice vindication. One more little point about after the war, and I owe this to Richard, who signed an article to me when he was American Heritage about plastic surgery. After the war, the industrial machine in America geared up for the war. Suddenly, we had all these wonderful products that we never knew we needed. We had a very affluent country, a very prosperous country. Because of the GI Bill and unions, we had a large growing middle class with a lot of discretionary income, and by the early 50s, credit cards in their pockets. During the war, plastic surgery essentially started as a specialty in World War I. World War II, it came of age. Suddenly the war was over, and we had a whole bunch of plastic surgeons, very well trained, who had nothing to do. Suddenly you had a population that was aging and had money in their pockets. It was a marriage made in heaven. So the war changed not only the way we live, but the way we look. And that's why aftermath of the war. And now we're going to go back to...
I do, she's quite, I mean, it's very, I had to, while I was at Heritage, I had to spend a lot of time with bound copies of Life magazine, which you'll remember minutely went through everything week by week. And George Orwell said once that a bound set of magazines is the closest thing we humans have to a time machine, and it certainly feels true going through those old lives. But it's very interesting as you get to where the war ends. The ads change. Everyone during the war is showing their, their role in making the engine nacelle for a bomber and stuff. But by 1944, 1945, suddenly it's all the new refrigerators and dishwashers you're going to have, and every painting shows an enchanted woman gazing at this thing as if it's her new twins, with a proud soldier standing behind her with his hand open. I mean, there are hundreds of these, and it was certainly all part of a wishful effort to get the guys out of uniform back to work without upsetting an entirely reestablished and quite effective social order. But it is interesting. What I will now say, so after effects of the war, and Ellen has now said aftermath of publishing books. I had an interesting aftermath of publishing my book just about 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you something nobody in this room knows, I am sure. A very pleasant lady by the name of Patricia Townend called me and left a message on the answering machine, if they're still called that, and said, I read your book, I liked it very much, and I have something that would interest you. So of course I called her back, and what she said would interest me was that I started by saying my father has seen the Frederick C. Davis, his sister ship, sunk. She was destroyer escort number 136. He was on destroyer escort 150. They all had hull numbers. And beyond the Davis was the Hyder, destroyer escort 212. And my father's ship was first sent in to pick up survivors, and then it was ordered off after the submarine, and the Hyder came in to pick them up. Now, these destroyer escorts, little ships, cheaply built, quickly, not as good as destroyers, but good enough to be faster than a submarine, were named for the most part, for people who died earlier in the war. And this woman told me that her father, Robert Hyder, was the one the ship was named after, and I looked him up, and by God, he certainly was. He won the Navy Cross in the terrible fighting off Guadalcanal. Now, she was a very little girl, but she went to the launching of the ship, and the crew adopted her. In effect, I mean, she's kept in touch with all of them all her life. She's still in touch with the survivors, but she and the Hyder, destroyer escort 212, did a very noble job with the survivors, and it had a proud crew. Now, when the war ended, and the guys went back to civilian life, of course, every ship had to have a highly sophisticated communications system. Certainly every one that was fighting submarines did, because so much was done by acoustics and radar. And these guys went into a rapidly expanding civilian, technical civilian sphere. And the chief communications officer of the Hyder was assigned to dole out area codes in the Northeast. And he said, I am going to build a secret monument to my ship in the greatest city in the world, and that's why we bask in the area code 212. I am scared to look it up.
I can't wait to tell it.
It certainly, it has that will-o'-the-wisp thing, the ring of truth, but I looked it up enough to know that yes, there was some guy who was assigned to do this, and that this was happening right after the war, and we were being doled out area codes. But I thought if I go any further than that, I'm going to find out it's not true, and damn it. So, but anyway, that's what she told me, and it seems an odd thing to invent. But I like that.
And now, on a sadder note, I'm going to ask you to tell the story
Yes.
about your father and his.
Well, that was one of the more appealing aftermaths of the war. But I do think, when I was working at American Heritage, there was always a steady resistance from advertisers, and who knows, perhaps everybody, to history. It's, the past is such a bully that one gets a sense that everything that, the present is such a bully that one gets the sense that everything in the past was kind of all settled, and people then were a little simpler and more complacent and content than we are. And of course, we in American Heritage were always at war with this, saying no, 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 and there was a big push for relevance. And if I had to, I mean, of course, I think history is relevant. I mean, just the way memory is all we know. But if I had to say what was relevant about Ellen and my books in those terms, it's sort of encapsulated in the post-war story of my father. You know, the Navy had gotten awful damn good by then, and by 1945. And he fought that submarine in the last submarine offensive of the Atlantic War. And by that time, there were pamphlets circulating around the ship, well gotten up, serious psychological things saying to the boys aboard, look, it's going to be harder than you think getting back. And my father looked at these with a sort of amused pity at his own architectural business. It was waiting for him. His partner had kept it going throughout the war. It was doing well. It was wild to get back to it. He came home, you know, put on a suit, happily went to work, picked up a pencil, and froze. If someone, he told me, said, you know, put a window here in this study, or do the plannings around there, he'd do a sure and confident job. But if he was asked to have any idea, anything, he had lost all confidence in this aspect of his gifts. And his partner couldn't have been nicer about it. He said, "Come on, you've been through a lot. We're doing fine. Draw your windows until you feel better." He got embarrassed. He left. He gave over the firm. And one day, I remember my mother telling me she got a call from him, and he was, and you could tell from the noise in the background that he was standing on a subway platform somewhere, and he said, "I called to say goodbye." And she said, "Of course, oh no, come home." Yeah. And then she waited in misery for hours until she heard his key in the door. He didn't, of course, kill himself, or I wouldn't be here. But you know, now here it is. The war never laid a glove on him, and the peace almost killed him. And I think when we still have men and women on a very live fighting front, and many more coming home from one that's just starting to get quiet, we have to remember what Ellen's book so, I think, beautifully exemplifies, that, you know, in many ways, for the rest of your life, the war you're leading has just begun, and its injuries are very often grievous and very often invisible. That's...
I was just going to say one thing.
She had this.
Yeah, first of all, the story of Richard's father, you told me that, and I could never get over it, the idea of him standing in the subway saying goodbye to his mother. My novel is sometimes called historical fiction. It's not, for me. I call it reminiscent fiction, because these are the stories I grew up on. And when I start writing a novel, I know, obviously, what I'm writing about. I know plot, I know characters. It isn't often until I'm almost halfway, three-quarters of the way through, that I know what the real driving force is, the passion that made me want to write this book. It wasn't until I was more than halfway through this book that I realized a character in it, which we read it, Mac the doctor, is based on a favorite uncle of mine who was in the service, came home, was not physically, he had been at the front. He'd been in, I don't know what they called MASH units in World War II?
No.
No, okay, whatever they were called in World War II. See, this is my researcher.
I don't think they were. I said that with
yeah.
great confidence, and I can't defend it, but I don't think so.
Yeah, he came home and he was not physically damaged, but he never practiced medicine again. He couldn't do it. He had practiced, I think he'd seen too much in the war, and he was never quite the same. And this is, in a way, I guess, this book is my tribute to him, as well as other things I wanted to say. But I think what Richard said is right, that you come home from a war, and the war is just beginning in some ways. So I guess, if questions and answers?
Yeah. Anyone has
Any questions or anything?
My father did get another job. He ended up his days quite happily and productively.
Doing what?
Architecture. He just never had his own firm again. He was working for another firm, but he was pretty well. He got pretty well up the ladder there, and I think for the latter part of his life he had a pretty good time. I mean, he wasn't haunted by it. He certainly wasn't one of those people who wouldn't talk about the war. He was always interested in talking about it when I brought it up. And of course, it's funny to think of that world right now that I was growing. I was born in '47, and when I was growing up, everybody's father had been in. There was nothing, it was just, oh, my dad got a haircut. So what? I mean, it was, Billy Richards' father had been in tanks. Chris von Schulgen's father was in a B-17, but everyone had been in it. And now, that has gone from our lives forever. The military is, still a pillar of our society, but we don't. The overwhelming majority of Americans don't know somebody who's serving, I think.
Less than 1%.
Yeah.
Or serving, I mean, not know.
How long did it take your father?
To get back? It's funny, he said, I asked him that, and he said, I think I can gauge it pretty exactly. He said, I had one absolutely black and miserable year, which would have brought him to 46, and then he said things started to brighten, almost imperceptibly. But he said, I think I felt I was back in it and ready to go back to work when I found out your mother was pregnant. and that was, and I don't know how he found it out. She was, I was a prodigy you're looking at here. I believe I was the product of the oldest first pregnancy in New York State history in 1947. She was 46 years old for a first pregnancy and didn't find out she was pregnant until she returned a girdle to Altman's and was insulted by
Are you sure your mother wants you to tell the story?
Well, she told it to me. It was insulted by the clerk who said, "Madam, this fit you when I sold it. I believe you were pregnant." So she had to go to a doctor to confirm her girdle salesman's diagnosis.
And the rest is Richard.
Hi, I'm so moved by both of your stories, and
Here.
I happen to have been married. I married to a man who got the Purple Heart at the Battle of the Bulge, who had never, ever wanted to speak about his war experiences, but the husband before him landed at Normandy and could never leave the Omaha beaches. And I have a story, a stage play in my head, sort of written a la John Osborne, of these boys who they left Harvard or all colleges to go into the war, as my present husband left Princeton. And then they came back, and many of them were so shell-shocked that Harvard, for instance, put them in isolated dorm rooms and to help them calm their nerves before going back to class.
If I said, you mean alone or together? What?
They put them in suites, but they didn't have roommates.
Right, yeah, right.
And they also wore their uniforms to class, and I thought very powerful stage play of the professors who never saw action, teaching philosophy or literature or anything to these young boys that just had to grow up overnight. But I will leave this story on a light note. My husband's suite mate, they didn't speak for 6 months, and finally going to breakfast one morning, they struck up a conversation. They became very good friends, and this suite mate, this is worth the telling, introduced him to his cousin. He was an only child, and his cousin was like his sister to him. And it was Barbara Walters. So,
for heaven's sake.
My husband at Harvard dated Barbara Walters. Well, it didn't go over so well, but her cousin had done missions over Romanian oil fields, which was probably one of the most dangerous things you can do. And I was always in awe of both of these men, sacrifices and guts. And whenever we'd get together with Selig, he would talk about the war with my husband, and it was like a history lesson all over again. So last summer, I was having lunch, and across the restaurant was Barbara Walters with her assistant. And no one else was in the restaurant, or I wouldn't have done this, and I knew she wasn't having a heady meeting. So I went over and I said, "Pardon me, but are you Selig Alcon's cousin?" And she was so mortified that someone wasn't saying, "Are you Barbara Walters?" But she didn't think it was very funny at all, but I just thought, I'm chalking one up for the boys.
You bet. Oh, that makes me think the less of her.
How did the aftermath of the war affect your life personally? Yeah.
Mine, very well indeed. I think when I look at it in that, well, my father didn't have his own architectural firm, so I wasn't as rich as I might have been, but I was living in an absurdly rich society. Every manufacturing plant in Europe had been flattened. My parents brought me out to the suburbs. I grew up in a prosperous time because, again, American industry was the only one that hadn't been crippled by the war, and so I had an extremely comfortable growing up. My father, I mean, what sufferings my father might have gained from it were never visible to me. I never dreamed about his problems with readjusting until he told me about them. And as I say, I grew up in that extraordinary wave of post-war prosperity. Was much more than I deserved. So in that sense, I think I did very well. And it also remains a phase of history that has fascinated me almost all my life. So I feel I benefited more from the Second World War than anybody fought in it.
A couple of points of interest. In 1943, when I turned 18, could not wait to enlist. And that was also true of all my friends, because we were at war and you had to get into the war. And this was true of everybody. No one, in fact, those poor guys that were 4F were so embarrassed because they couldn't wear a uniform. And after the war, the GI Bill of Rights, when we went to school, we wore our uniforms only because we couldn't buy clothes. You couldn't get a blue suit for the simple reason that they just blew, they were making uniforms.
Yeah, the same thing with cars and stuff. It took a while to get civilian production back, right?
And I remember, because when I was a cadet, I had a Navy uniform, so I kept it. And, when we went out, you cut the gold buttons off and you wore it. That's the way it worked.
Another way of benefit for World War II, my father had a bridge coat that he cut the same thing, cut the gold buttons off and wore it for years. And when I went off to college, I found it fit me perfectly. And this was the '60s when it was perfectly fine if you dressed up in some military stuff you hadn't earned.
He wore that jacket.
Good for him.
That's very good.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ellen, for a great evening. We did record this event, so it will be on our website and available if you have friends who would like to listen to the audio or watch the video. Did you pick up a copy of the books tonight? Thanks for coming.
Thank you.